No, I am. Good morning. I thank you so much. Good morning.
There we go. All right. Good to see everybody. Looks like all of us guys forgot to buy our wives a corsage. They used to have corsages on Easter, didn't they? But of course, they wore hats and white gloves and all that stuff too, long time ago. Good to see everybody. As you may have known, we're going to start in the book of Revelation. Thanks, Bob. The book of Daniel this morning, and hope we can accomplish some things in the task of trying to understand the book. Before we get started, though, I'm going to ask Ricky if he'll lead us in prayer.
Thank you so much for another opportunity to assemble here in Bible class. We ask that the things that will be taught this morning, that we can meditate on them and apply those things into our lives. Daniel is a great book to study. We ask that we can come back again and visit the book. We ask that you be with the teacher of the hour. Continue to be with him. Continue to give him the strength and the tenacity to study your word and also to present your word in a manner where all of us can understand and appreciate your word. We love you so much and thank you so much for your son, Jesus. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Ricky. All right, I did have a handout back there. I don't know if you all saw it or not. If you want the handout, maybe somebody, if you'll raise your hand, somebody will hand them out to you. If not, just get one. I think it will help you in the book of Daniel if you pick up the handouts, but that's up to you. Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy, and he says that God would have all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of truth. Jesus said in John chapter 17, when he's praying to the Lord, he said, sanctify them in the truth. Thy word is truth. So as we go into this class, and as we look at the things in this study, I am going in with the assumption that everybody believes here that God's word is absolute truth. And as such, is of great value to us, and will help us to become more united and closer together with Him and one another. Now, before we go any further, I want Gene to read to us from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Gene?
Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
That's good, thank you. Okay, so Isaiah talks about a time when all peoples will flow into what? What do you read there? The mountain of the Lord, remember that? That's the church. We'll talk about that a little later on down the line. So we know the Bible's truth, and we know that Isaiah said, there's going to be a time which would coincide with Abraham being a blessing to all the families of the earth, that there's going to be a time when all peoples are going to flow into the mountain of Jehovah, right? And that is the church. Now, our brother's going to read to us, Lawrence, from Jeremiah 31 through 34. I think I gave you, right?
Yep.
Okay.
The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. And it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. Because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is a covenant I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more.
Okay, so Brother Lawrence, there's going to be a time when God will forgive wickedness and remember sins no more. There's going to be a new covenant, correct? And so Isaiah said there's going to be a time when all people shall flow into it. And there's going to be also, along with that, a new covenant. Now, what's interesting about Daniel is Daniel kind of, I think, pulls things together. Because Daniel's going to tell us basically when all this happens and what world empire is established when this is to happen, because Daniel's going to name it. And Daniel's going to talk about a lot of things. So I think the study can be interesting. Now, when you look at Daniel, don't try to make it a myth. You know, look at Daniel and say, okay, what is the passage saying? Now, John has worked with you all a lot on that in inductive Bible study. What is the passage saying? And so that's what we're going to find out. And there's a lot, there's horns and there's just all sorts of things in Daniel that people have a hard time with. I think the book of Daniel is a wonderful book and an encouraging book. Now, as we get into the introduction, I kind of cleared this through the head of education, and that's John. I said, John, so you go to the one that you know will be okay with it. I said, John, what do you think? I've got all these dates I'd like to put up there as an introduction. And he said, well, yeah, go ahead and do that. So we're going to do that. We're going to give a brief timeline. Now, I hope it's brief, but I think the timeline is very, very important because it helps us understand the depth of the book and the period that the book covers. Now, Daniel doesn't just sit down and just write the book. There's a timeline here, and it'll help us kind of pull together to understand the book. Now, of course, Daniel's born in about 620 BC. Okay, a long time ago, right? In about 605 BC, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, and shouldn't have forgotten that, and Mishael. That's, we don't know them usually by that name, do we? But he and his three friends go into captivity in about 605 BC. And as we move on along in history, we're going to find out that about 602 BC, Daniel and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael finished their training. Their training as what? Does anybody remember? Counselors to the king. And we're going to look at all that, all right? And so if they're about 15 when they go into captivity, or Daniel is, he's maybe about 18 or 19 by the time this training's over, right? And we don't know for sure the exact time, but during this period of time also, not only do the three finish their period of learning, but Daniel's also going to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream about a statue made of gold and silver and bronze and iron and clay. And we're going to go right down through all those, and we're going to look at those and see exactly what those things are talking about, all right? So as we move on then, we go on to about 589 BC, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to begin the siege of Jerusalem. Now turn to 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. Now, Jerusalem is already under the authority of Nebuchadnezzar. But the city still stands, and they have a puppet king, correct? And the puppet king kind of defies him, which is really defying God, and he's going to pay the price. But anyhow, now about this date, in 589 BC, there's a siege that Nebuchadnezzar puts around Jerusalem. And what is a siege? The army surrounds it, and they just stay there until the people what? Starve out. Okay? Until they're weak enough to go. And they build ramps and they try to tear down walls and all that. But a siege is going on. Now, in some of these dates, you might say, well, I don't agree with that. That may be 590 or maybe 587. Okay? We're looking at approximate dates here, the best that we can figure out. So look at chapter 25 of 2 Kings. Verses 1, we'll go through verses 1 through 4. Now, in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th of the day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and his army, against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So the city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Is that what Nebuchadnezzar wants? Absolutely. So we've got this siege going on, and John talked to you a little bit about some things. I'm not going to go into all the things he talked about, but just know this is kind of a timeline of what's going on. So that siege goes on. And as we go on and we move a little further along, about 586 BC, you have the idea that Jerusalem's walls are coming down. The temple and the palace are going to be burnt to the ground. In other words, at that time, Nebuchadnezzar has the city. Now, as we look at this time period, we're going to note several things about that I think is interesting. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to pay homage to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. And as I said earlier, we're going to take a look at some of those things. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to confront those three fellas and give them another chance to change. But you remember the story. They refused to worship the golden image, so they end up being tossed into what? The fire. And so we're going to take a look at that, and that'll be in Daniel chapter 3. So in 586, those walls come down, and let's just kind of take a look at verses 4 to 10 of 2 Kings 25. Well, we've already read verse 4. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. In other words, when the siege is finally at the end and Nebuchadnezzar's coming in, where does the king go? He really loves his people, right? He's a leader of the end. No, he flees, doesn't he, with the men of war. So anyhow, he's overtaken. Verse 6, then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah and passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. And then you remember the story. What they do to Zedekiah? Can you imagine the last thing you saw in the world was your son slaughtered? And then they took him into the captivity. Now on the 7th day, verse 8 of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great house he burned with fire. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Where was Daniel during this time period? He was in Babylon, wasn't he? And so remember when they first went, Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy the city. He didn't have time. He had to get back. He's got other things to do. Left some puppet kings and so forth. And Zedekiah, when he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, rebelled against who? God, because this was God's plan. So just kind of think about that as we go through this. Now, we move on and we move on to 563 and 562 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is going to experience this vision of a tree that's a great tree being cut down, bam, put around a stump, and being driven from the people and losing his sanity. And you'll remember that story, and we'll talk about that. In the end, you'll remember he praises God, and after 7 months, if it's 7 months, his sanity was restored to him. And that's in Daniel chapter 4. Now, this is all going on, this time period is all going on during the time period that Daniel's in captivity. And so that's why I thought it was interesting. As we move on in history, from 562 to 549, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. Now Nabonidus is king. But he's off journeying some other things. I think you talked about him, didn't you, John? He's off. He's a religious nut in antiquity and stuff, and he's rebuilding some temples. He's not in Babylon. Instead, he appoints his son Belshazzar to be co-regent in Babylon. You remember in chapter 5 the thing about Belshazzar. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Daniel experiences during this time also a vision of the 4 terrifying beasts, but keeps the vision to himself. Well, there's a lot to look at in just a few short chapters, aren't there? And a lot of time that moves on, and that's what's interesting about this, to me. May not be to you, but to me. So we move on to 548 to 547. Daniel's going to receive the vision of the ram and a goat, and we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to understand that. And during this time period, there's a voice that tells him the meaning of this vision. And Daniel go to Daniel chapter 8. Let's see what happens to Daniel. Chapter 8. Look at verse 27. Daniel 8, verse 27. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. So Daniel gets this vision, and it unfolds there in chapter 8. He's wanting it explained, and it's not explained at this time. But what are the results of Daniel receiving this vision for him? Huh? Doesn't know what it means, but what else? Look at the first part of the verse.
Exhausted and sick.
Exhausted and sick, did you say?
Yeah.
Yes. So can you imagine how seriously this young man, who's taken into captivity at 15 years of age, ends up a counselor for Nebuchadnezzar? Does he have a choice? And whether he was made a eunuch or not, we do not know. We know that he didn't have a family, apparently. So there's a lot of things going on in his life that is not his decision. And he has this vision, and it so concerns him that he's actually sick. He's worn out. It's just like he can't move. You ever felt like that? From just things in the world? And this is a message that God's giving him. Now, we're going to know who that ram and goat is. And it's going to be explained to us. But I just think it's interesting. What I think is interesting about it is Daniel knows that all this concerns his people. And this is being dropped on him. And it's a heavy burden to him. Is there a lesson? I don't know. Maybe there is, if we want to draw a lesson from it. How burdened do we become when we realize what the world is like without Christ? You know? How burdened do we become when we realize that some of our children or family members have died without Christ, right? And so you can see that these great saints in the Old Testament, you know, became burdened with these things. And they bore burdens just like we would. Sometimes they're exhausting. You know, and we've run into people who are exhausted with burdens, and we say, oh, come on, let's get up and put everything together. Daniel was that way for just a short time. But he did go up and go to work. It didn't say he wasn't still burdened, does it? But I just think it was kind of interesting for us to look at there. Anybody want to add anything to this historically? Okay. Well, we're going to move on to what is an interesting period of time. It starts in chapter 5. Belshazzar is going, whoops. There we go. Belshazzar is going to hold this great feast. Now, Babylon is basically under attack. And he's holding this great feast, and we'll talk all about that later. And you remember he went and he said, bring out all the items from the temple in Jerusalem. And he was drinking wine out of them, remember? And as they were probably drunk and moving along, and there was a party, we'll talk about some reasons they could have been having this. But you remember there was handwriting on the wall. And it's interesting. It's many, many tekel upsin. It depends. Your translation might, the last word might be a little closer to that. But this is puzzling him. Now, these fellows they're multilingual, right? He doesn't know what this means. And remember, the Queen Mother comes in, and we'll talk about who she might be, but suggests that he calls one Daniel. Isn't that right? And Daniel's able to do what? Interpret it, and we'll look at that. So, and of course, it's not Daniel that really interprets it, but it's God in heaven. At this time, we'll notice that evening, Babylon is overrun by the Persian king Cyrus, and takes the kingdom. And that's in Daniel 5:30. He's invaded Babylon. He's captured it. Cyrus is the emperor of Persia, and it seems to be at that time that he appoints Darius the Mede as a viceroy for Babylon, and we'll discuss that, or as his representative there. And so Darius is very, very important in many of the stories that go on. You'll also notice that after Darius was appointed, that he noted Daniel's good qualities. And isn't that interesting? Daniel served the Babylonian king as a captive, and he ends up serving Darius as a captive, because in captivity he did what? When most of us would run and hide, what was he doing? He was fulfilling the task God gave him. He counseled to who? The kings. He was, and so very, very important man. But it's interesting, and you'll remember that the other administrators in the land resented this idea and thought of ways to ruin Daniel. And you remember they came up with an edict, persuaded Darius that to have no prayer except to him for how many days? No prayer to any other gods. And he signed it. And once a Persian document was signed, could it be reversed even by the one that signed it? No. But we'll see how those things work out. And so anyhow, I think that's interesting. And if you did fall down and worship anyone else, any of your other gods during that time period, you were thrown in the lion's den. And it's a public decree. Well, we have often talked about Daniel and we've made it a children's story. It's not a children's story. I mean, it can be a children's story. But anyhow, they through time, they find Daniel praying, right? And they turn him into Darius, and Darius calls Daniel forward. And it's a real interesting passage, because I think Darius, and many of you do, had a relationship with Daniel, some kind of a relationship where he didn't really want to see Daniel die. Did he give Daniel a chance to repent and change? He did, but Daniel's not going to do that, right? So he has to throw Daniel in the lion's den, whether he wants to or not. He has no choice. But he signed the edict. Doesn't matter. The law of the Persians and the Medes says once it's signed in, it can't be revoked. And so Daniel goes in the lion's den. You remember the story. God protected him all night. And Darius will go back, and we'll talk about that, and takes him out of the lion's den and throws who in the lion's den? You all remember. All the fellows that tried to trap him and their wives and their children. So it's a very precarious time and a difficult time. And I'm glad that I did not have to live through that time. Daniel prays and fasts about this and about the things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And let's see. Let's move on here a little further and see what else we got. In about 538 BC, Cyrus decrees that the Jews can return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. We move on to 537 to 536, depending on your own timeline. About 50,000 Jews go back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel's leadership and Joshua's leadership. He was the high priest. And Daniel has the vision of the end of times. And we'll discuss that. But can you imagine having to guide 50,000 people back? And many of them had never been where? To Jerusalem. It's been how long? 70 years, and we'll take a look at that, all right? 70 years. Now, so Daniel has a vision over here. We run into him in Luke chapter chapter 2, and in Matthew chapter 1. Who was his name? What was his name? Gabriel, okay. And so I think it's pretty interesting. When we get to about 530, it's believed that Daniel died somewhere between 535 and 530 BC. So some believe that Daniel actually made it back to Jerusalem. That would have been a gift for him, wouldn't it? He's taken into captivity, when he's 15 years old, and whatever time he died at 85, 86, or 87, whatever it was, for him to be able to die in his homeland. I think the amazing thing about Daniel you'll find as we go through this whole study is Daniel never complained to God about what God had him doing. He had some trouble with it, just like we would. There'll be some stress you'll see, some exhaustion, but he never said, why me? And it's interesting when you look at him and Jeremiah was a great prophet, right? Jeremiah said, I've had enough, right? But when he decided to quit, he couldn't because the word burned as a fire within his bones. Daniel there's just something really special about this man. And I think probably about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which would have been the Babylonian names that they carried. And we'll look at what those names mean. They all seem to be faithful and willing to pay the price, right? Basically, you'll remember when the three men were thrown into the fires, they said, God will what? He'll take care of it. And so it's an amazing story, and I think it's an amazing truth, let's put it that way. The mistake we make sometimes in teaching, I think sometimes, younger folks, is we don't really tell them enough what it's all about. And all this is going on for one purpose, I think, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. Anybody want to add anything to this timeline that you may know? It's not a complete timeline, okay? It's just a brief one. I don't know what I did, but okay. All right. I think there are some interesting characteristics about the book of Daniel. It's not just written in Hebrew. It's written also in the Aramaic language. Kind of interesting, right? Why? I don't know. But what I think is interesting about it is it made me remember something. I was in Ghana a number of years ago, and Dan Osima, he and another preacher were taking me and two others. We were going to a refugee camp, and the dumb Americans are sitting in the back seat while they do their talking between them, you know, laughing every once in a while. I'd say, "You're laughing about us, aren't you?" And they'd say, "Well, maybe." But anyhow, you'd hear them in their native tongue, and all of a sudden you'd hear English words. Then they'd go back to their native tongue. And then because they speak it all the time. Now, Dan knew 4 languages. And it was amazing when he'd be speaking, once in a while you may hear a French word. And he didn't even know he says it. And when they were talking in the front seat, I said, are you going to speak in English so we could understand? He said, we didn't know we spoke in English. You know, so I don't know why this was written like it was. I'm sure some scholars have their own ideas and everything. But Daniel, would he have been fluent in the Aramaic language? Yeah, he would have. Probably fluent in several languages. People were multilingual in those days. Any comments? John, go ahead.
Aramaic was kind of like English or the French of that day, where all the diplomacy and all that kind of stuff was done. That language had the same character set, I believe, as Hebrew, and a lot of the words are kind of similar. That doesn't really help explain why this part's written in Aramaic and the other part's written in Hebrew.
But that may be a natural thing for him, right? To do that? So you can see the chapters that are in Hebrews, and chapter 1, 1 through 2, 4, Hebrews, chapter 2, 4 through 728 Aramaic, and chapter 8, 1 through chapter 12, 13 is Hebrew. That could give translators some difficulties at times figuring out what's really meant by certain things. And by the way, on Thursday mornings, here in a few weeks after our brother Steve is done, Steve is going to be teaching on Thursday mornings, if some of the older folks are available, on holiness. And then we're going to go into hermeneutics. And you've already had some of that from John with his inductive Bible studies. We're going to go into it a little more. So just wanted to throw that in for a little bit of information. Now, what about the structure of the book? I think it's interesting. It is not written chronologically. What do I mean by chronologically? In order. Right, in order. And that wasn't unusual for the writings of that period. If you've read 1st and 2nd Kings, you know that, right? And other books of the Old Testament. What is interesting is that the vision of the last 6 chapters occur almost at the same time frame of the first 6 chapters. And so not being written chronologically will help explain that, and we'll try to pull all that together. Now, there's a lot of outlines of the book. You can get into very extensive outlines of the book of Daniel. And we don't really want to do that. There's a guy by the name of James Smith that offers a chronology of the events of the book, which may help you. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar is from chapters 1 through 4. The reign of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Belshazzar is Nabonidus' son. He's the viceroy in place of his dad, or the king in place of his dad. We'll talk about some of that. That's chapters 5, 7, and 8. Isn't that interesting? And then we have the reign of Cyrus and Darius, which are chapters 6, 9, 10 through 12. So your timeline and your thinking as the way we read as Americans could get a little confusing, right? I mean, I can remember one of the things we had to do in school, we had to be able to name all the kings, the northern and southern kings, and all the prophets and how they interacted time-wise, date-wise. It gets quite confusing, doesn't it? But remember, that's how they wrote then. That would not have been as confusing to them as it is to us sometimes. So you may want to do some other extensive things in outlines, or you may not. But that'll just give you a basic idea of whose reigns we are in and where we're going to go after we've looked at some dates. And so I hope that helps you some, and I'll help you move through the book. Now, what about the date of the writing? Was it written just a few days before he died, or what? There's an early date of 536 that most scholars agree on, and I agree on it. And this would be just a few years after the Persian king Cyrus captured the city of Babylon. One of the evidences of an early date, and some have a later date on it, we're taking the early date. Evidences of early date is the fact that it is in the Hebrew canon. Copies of Daniel were also among the Dead Sea Scrolls. As a matter of fact, the Jews living at Qumran often quoted from Daniel. So Daniel was an accepted book in the Hebrew canon. And it was quoted from, and there were among the Jewish people, there was no doubts about this book belonging. And if you want to search that a little more, you can, John. Oh, you did the beard thing. You got to stop that, okay? Okay. All right. John's the boss, he runs it, so I'm going to yield to him there. But anyhow, now, you're going to notice, you read this book, that it's written basically in first person, right? For most of the things. I don't know where Daniel was when the three guys were thrown into the fire. I don't, really. We'll figure it, but he wasn't there. But this book's basically written in first person. You're going to observe, as we study this, it refers to himself as the witness of events over and over and over that he describes. And he also claims to be present in the royal court to Babylon. Very, very important. We've already mentioned that. All right? So he serves under the Babylonian kings, and he serves under Cyrus and Darius, okay? And very important for us to think about. I think it's also important to see that Daniel in chapter 1, verses 3 through 6, basically tells you, I think he's from the royal family. And Josephus, the great historian, author back in the first century, contended that Daniel and his three friends were all from the family of Zedekiah. And we'll talk briefly about that. So Daniel is of royal blood, goes into captivity, has to serve the king. If he would not have served the king well, if he would not have went through the 3 years, do you think he would have lived? But who wanted him there? God wanted him there, and he didn't fight God's purpose for him. And I think that's important for us to understand. Now, believe it or not, we only got one more thing, and then you're done. Next week, we're in Daniel chapter 1. Witness event. Okay. First of all, Daniel was written to convince faithful Jews that God had not forgotten them and would restore them to Jerusalem. Secondly, to show the pagan nations that God is truly sovereign. Go to chapter 2 and verse 21. I think we've all read this before at some time or another. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. So God removes kings and what? Sets them up. And he's letting the people know that, and he's letting the pagan nations know that God is truly sovereign. Now, we're going to talk about 5 kingdoms in this book. All right? The 5th kingdom is very, very important because it's not a physical kingdom. Daniel makes it clear. And what this is going to show us is, and if you look at most commentators, they don't say, it's just my idea, and I'm sure others have the same idea. I think Daniel is written to help us to understand the establishment of the New Testament church. And I'll share that with you, okay? Because we have all sorts of things going on in the book of Daniel that helps us historically to pinpoint it and understand when the church was established, what earthly ruler was in control. It'll talk about the Messiah. We'll just get into a whole bunch of things, okay, that I think will be interesting to you. The reason I think it's important is because we seem to have a hard time today in many places. It's been all around for ever since I can remember that God didn't establish many different religious groups. And you're probably tired of hearing me say this. He established one church. And we're going to know for sure what that one church is by the time we get back done with the book of Daniel. Now remember the things that John taught you in the book of Ezekiel about visions or know those kind of things and prophecy as we go into the book of Daniel. Any additions or questions? First bell must have rung, right? It's first bell, it's over at 1:45, right? I'm 3 minutes early. So you just all have a good time after we have prayer, okay? All right. Holy Father in heaven, thank you that we can begin to look at this great prophet of yours and help us to really appreciate Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Father, for their faithfulness. Just thank you that we could study this day in Christ's name. Oh, by the way, Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. What does that word mean? I think it's interesting that he